जिंदाबाद 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 जिंदाबाद.
Similar to different uprisings in other parts of the world, they do not happen overnight. It's not simply people getting together on Twitter or social media and quickly mobilizing one another. This is not something that just emerges spontaneously. So there's three specific farm laws that have been passed in June of 2020. The first one is the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Act of 2020. The second one is the Farmers Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act. And the third one is the Essential Commodities Act. To understand the farm laws, I think we need to situate them in a historical context. Colonial capitalism, in my view, what it indexes is that agriculture in the South is oriented towards industrial production in the North. And this has consequences in the South in the form of rising hunger, in the form of livelihood crises for agricultural producers. Extracting raw materials, agricultural inputs from global South states, such as wheat or cotton or indigo or other kind of raw material inputs at a low cost that were then fed into emerging manufacturing centers in the global North. And this kept the cost of industrial manufacturing, kept the cost of labor low, which then enabled high profits and capital accumulation for industries in the global North in the colonizing core. You cannot actually conceive of capitalism in the global North without it being built upon this form of colonial capitalist agricultural production in the South, even after post-colonial era. The Green Revolution does emerge in many ways as the definitive kind of post-colonial state agricultural policy to address the colonial legacy. Right? So the United States, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, they come in and they propose that if India wants to import grains at a time of crisis, it would be beneficial if they start to structurally transition to a different form of agriculture, which emphasizes rather than social transformation through land reform, it emphasizes technological solutions such as petroleum fertilizers, chemical pesticides, hybrid seeds. Though at the same time, mindful of peasant unrest, of farmer movements, the state does introduce a series of subsidies to make the taking up of these technologies more feasible for farmers. And this is actually where then you have the birth of the minimum support price and the public distribution food system. So the MSP, which is at the heart of many of the protests, the APMC, the Mandi system, is tied together with a food distribution system at the outset of the Green Revolution. These two systems are combined in a larger one called the Food Corporation of India. It's meant to offer support to both producers and consumers. Okay, so it's a complicated, contradictory process. The Green Revolution, while it did provide supports to the farmers, it introduced a really ecologically exhaustive form of agricultural production. It had a really deleterious impact on soils and water levels and pest management. And essentially, the implications here are that year after year, farmers in Green Revolution intensive states such as Punjab and Haryana, they had to continually put more fertilizer than the previous year, use more pesticides. So they have rising costs. And as these costs are rising, the IMF loan that comes to India in 1991, and when India begins its structural adjustment into neoliberalism, there is immense concern expressed by these kind of global governance institutions, such as the IMF and World Bank, around India's subsidy regime, around these rising costs, that the state should get out of agriculture, that it's inefficient to subsidize agriculture in this way, that the cost could be reduced if you allow more private players to enter into the Indian agricultural market. Something we forget in discussing the farm laws, that it's not something that the Modi government itself is the first to propose. It begins in the 90s. It's motivated by an ideology of neoliberalism that views the state and any state support as inefficient and irrational. That's the ideological kind of argument. But there's a kind of a materialist underpinning here where agribusiness corporations in the global North seek to enter into the Indian market and global South markets more generally. And so in the 90s, when neoliberalism first is implemented in Indian agriculture, the MSP is not rolled back. This is something that's really hard to touch because of farmer mobilization and resistance to this. But there are a series of neoliberal measures that are put in place in the 90s which lead to a deep agrarian crisis. Very significantly, the state rolls back the amount of public credit it offers to farmers, right? So farmers could access credit through public banks, through regional rural banks. And this allowed the farmer a way to access credit if there was a time between the planting and the harvest where funds were short and they didn't have to turn to an informal moneylender and fall into the debt trap that was the hallmark of colonialism. Input subsidies are markedly reduced. And although the MSP is not abolished, the MSP is in some years really undermined as the state will offer a lower price. It'll tinker with this. And then the public distribution system that I mentioned, that was a way to offer food at a subsidized price for the poor. This is transformed into a means-tested, targeted public distribution system in 1997, which really contributes to immensely rising hunger in India in 1990s and 2000s. And by the 2000s, there is broad kind of discussion and consensus that there is a deep agrarian crisis in India. Indebtedness is going up for farmers, right? And this leads to the tragedy of escalating farmer suicides in the early 2000s. The BJP government comes to power in 1998 to 2003 for the first time under the Vajpayee government. And they actually try to start making moves that are very similar to these three laws at that time. But the 2004 elections were really kind of a rejection of the agricultural policies, both of the BJP and of the Congress government before the BJP. In 2004, the UPA government is elected, and they introduce a series of welfare measures for the farm sector. And these welfare measures were explicitly opposed by rising Indian agribusiness capital and global agribusiness capital. And these forces seem to have a really close relationship with the Modi government and the BJP. So when they returned to power in 2014, very soon thereafter, there's a lot of excitement and eagerness from players such as Cargill and, of course, domestically, Reliance and other kind of corporate houses seeking to get into agriculture. The concept double movement, it was first put forward by Karl Polanyi, a mid-20th century social theorist, sociologist whose work has really become applicable across the social sciences. The double movement, what it signified for him was this double movement between two forces: the movement of the market and commodification on the one hand, and then the movement of the social response to the market. So the protection of society was the second movement. How increasingly land and labor and money became subject to commodification. So they were only produced to be bought and sold, which may have benefited those who owned those commodities, but certainly introduced heightened social insecurities for many others, which led those groups to then formulate a response, a second movement, the double movement, which was to try to decommodify, to subject these goods now to a different logic than the price form, that these are so essential to social reproduction that they should be provisioned through non-market means as well. And the double movement comes together to form the mid-20th century welfare state. So for Polanyi, the double movement was actually really tied fundamentally to something referred to as the agrarian question. And the agrarian question was put forward by 20th century and 19th century Marxist theorists who were looking at both what role agriculture and agricultural transformation should play in modern state formation and modern development, and also how agriculture and agricultural sectors are impacted by the transition to capitalism, industrialization, and so forth. And so for Polanyi, there's a double movement to this agrarian question. On the one hand, agriculture is subject to commodification. It's integrated into global market forces that threaten the livelihoods of farmers in Europe, and then they respond with a demand for state protection against the marketization and globalization of agriculture. In recent years, Nancy Fraser has actually questioned if we should think beyond a double movement and think about a triple movement. In the sense that this double movement in Europe between market and society, often the welfare compromise that was forged was underwritten by colonial wealth, right? Like wealth extracted from the colonies or from the third world. And so while that protection in the double movement may have been important, it had certain heightened insecurities for people in the global south. Fraser suggests maybe there's a triple movement where agricultural producers in the south and workers in the south are responding to that double movement. So it gets a little more complex, but I find Fraser's triple movement may be quite useful as well. It's not to say that domestic forces and domestic kind of class composition and state formation is not central here, but it's tied into a global context. We can think about how in the United States and in Europe in the mid 20th century, there was massive subsidies that were offered to the agricultural sectors in order to try to offset some of the consequences of the first round of agricultural globalization that really comes to crisis by the Great Depression. And so you have these subsidies that are offered to farmers that lead to actually a corporatization of agriculture and a concentration of agricultural production in the US and the EU in these large agribusiness corporations, maybe the most notable example, which is Cargill. And now as these subsidized corporations in the global north, again, these subsidies may be being in some ways coming out of the double movement. As they grow, they seek out new markets and they seek out new sources of raw material. So these growing subsidized agribusiness corporations have had their eye on the Indian market for decades, going back to the 1970s and 1980s. There's a way in which the subsidization of agriculture bears upon what's happening in India and how this is now being responded to in that triple movement framework, that now you have farmers in India, you have a farmer labor alliance seeking to contest the incorporation of Indian agriculture into the global economy on terms beneficial both to Indian capital, large Indian capital, and to these transnational agribusiness corporations. A crisis across the global south is that there is really no evidence that a post-agricultural transition to post-agricultural employment has anywhere been demonstrated. When people have been pushed out of agricultural livelihoods due to neoliberal globalization, they often end up working informal labor in cities. They end up living in slums. And this is something when you listen to the protesters, they're acutely aware of, that they will be transformed into a surplus labor. It's built on a really heightened consciousness of farmers and laborers in Punjab and Haryana and elsewhere that were really aware from the last 20, 30 years of neoliberalism, that there was a policy framework that was jeopardizing their livelihoods. It starts in Punjab and then the farmers enter into Delhi and start a permanent occupation or blockade of certain parts of Delhi in the fall. There was a militancy they brought where they did not go to the spaces of the squares that are normally associated with acceptable, legitimized protest sites. And instead they broke through the blockades where the government was trying to keep them out of. This is being fueled by an understanding by farmers that there is no post-agricultural livelihood waiting for them. They brought the Modi project, the Hindutva project, the embrace of Hindutva and global capital and national capital, they brought it to crisis. I think the actual mechanism of the protest, the form of the protest, the blockade, the occupation have been incredibly effective. It seems as though this moment of crisis and mobilization is bringing to crisis that form of politics, right? There's a potential, I mean, we don't want to overplay it, right? It's not to overly romanticize what's going on here, but there is a way in which in moments of crisis and potentially a revolutionary contestation that received kind of assumptions around caste, around religious nationalism. These sorts of processes are questioned more, right? So you saw in Delhi these immense debates, so not simply the opposition to the government, but these debates happening on the ground around land reform, around gender, around caste, right? You saw reports coming out how there was a space that was opened up for this real kind of revolutionary ferment, and it reminded you of other uprisings you've read about, whether it's the Iranian Revolution or elsewhere, how they always open space for a critical self-reflection on a range of social relations. So as you see the protests broadening, right, and people coming in from UP and Bihar, is this going to open a space to rethink the hegemony of the BJP model, that the emphasis was on a form of cultural and religious nationalism, that really undermined or diminished emphases on class questions, questions on solidarity across more marginalized groups. It's not to be overly dramatic here, but that the stakes are so high for farmers and laborers in the whole agricultural sector that they're refusing to budge until these laws are repealed.